Hello and welcome to Matters of Faith. My name is Christiane Bakker and today we're coming to you from Cambridge, where we're going to be speaking to one of the great experts on one of the most important scholars of Islamic theology. He is the leader of a new mosque project in Cambridge, which he's building with use of Islam, and his name is Abdul Hakeem Murad, or Tim Winter. Welcome to Matters of Faith.
Thank you.
Now, what made you such an expert, or what sparked your interest in Abu Hamid Muhammad Al-Ghazali?
Well, I think that the world lacks a real expert on Ghazali at the moment, partly because his legacy is so gigantic. Even though he died only at the age of 55, he left behind maybe 200 books, including some which are multi-volume, complex encyclopedias of everything from Islamic law to theology to mysticism to ethics. And there is really nobody around who has really mastered the complexity of this legacy. My own interest is really derived from my interest in Islam itself, because I think that by the consensus of the scholars of the community, Al-Ghazali is the greatest mind that Islamic civilization has ever come up with, and his books really are indispensable. And Nawawi, who is one of the great jurists of Islamic law, said if all of the books were to be lost, there was some earthquake or flood, some catastrophe, and only the Ihya, the book of Al-Ghazali called The Revival, survived, it would be enough. In other words, it's so comprehensive, so encyclopedic, it deals with inward things, outward things, formal things, spiritual things, everything that you really need, that basically what you need for your Islam is there. And there isn't really another book and another thinker in the history of the civilization that can compete with that. So if you've understood Ghazali, you can say you've really figured out Islam.
Yeah, and he gives these tools of transformation, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's go through his life a little bit, starting with his early life. He lost his father at quite a young age. At what point did he really start his quest for knowledge?
Well, as was normal in the day, he was apprenticed to a scholar at a very early age, probably shortly after he could walk, because boys at that age were all educated. This was a highly cultivated civilization. But what's interesting about his childhood pursuit of knowledge is that it seems to have had two directions, and the way in which they interrelate becomes very important for the subsequent resolutions of the tensions in his career. Because we have accounts of him as a teenager during the day attending in the great mosque of the city of Nishapur the formal classes in dialectical, scholastic theology, a lot of logic and a lot of discussions of the nature of language, very dry academic metaphysical stuff, very brilliant, at the hands of one of the great scholars of the day called Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. And he does this very formal philosophical rationalizing religion during the morning. And then we have this image of him getting on his mule or his donkey in the afternoon and going out of the city of Nishapur to a garden, to a rose garden on the outskirts, where he's in a very different sort of environment, and where he sits at the feet of somebody called Abu Ali al-Farmadi, who is a Sufi teacher, who is not using the language of logic chopping to work out the existence and the nature of God, but is using a language of the heart. It's about the nightingale and the rose blossom and the beloved and the fragrance and the moon, and it's all the great images of Persian poetry. And that really defines the tensions of his career. Is he to be following the religion of the mind or the religion of the heart? So from an early age we see him following those two paths simultaneously, and that really generates the great energy which makes him what he is.
Fascinating. There was a famous incident that happened where he was robbed of his books.
Oh, yes.
Could you tell us about that?
Yes, we know that he was extraordinarily brilliant and that he mastered and memorized all of the great texts of the day. But that he also had with him lecture notes that were gigantically important to him. And as he was traveling from the city of Jurjan in Central Asia to another city, according to the story, the caravan is waylaid by highwaymen, by brigands, and they want to take his notes. And he says, take my jewels, take everything, take my horse, but don't take my notes, because I've spent several years accumulating all of this wisdom. And the leader of the gang, who obviously is a person of some discernment, says, if I take away these pieces of paper, then you're nothing. What's the point of it if this is all that you are? And that really, despite the sort of roughness of the person that offered this nasiha, this advice, cut the Imam to the quick, and he realised, all I've been acquiring is a bunch of lecture notes and a lot of information. But what is the point of that if I'm not inwardly transformed? What's the point of just being like, as the Quran says, a donkey carrying scrolls? Shouldn't it be the consequence of one's search for knowledge to become a wise person? And that, in a sense, was the beginning of his doubts and the beginning of his crisis.
Now, he said, after completing my theology studies, I started to study philosophy. I had come to the conclusion at the time that one cannot see problematic aspects of any field of science without comprehending that field of science. Now, what do you make of his approach to science? And I mean, I guess he lived that as well, as you were saying.
Yes, what he was referring to was one of the great controversies of his age, which was Islamic civilization had emerged from Arabia and had suddenly gone out to transform a huge chunk of the planet. And the question was, what was going to be the relationship between the new Quranic wisdom and the older wisdoms of the people that were now trading up to the new monotheism of Islam? And the biggest controversy of all was, is there any point in studying the wisdom of the ancients in terms of Plato and Aristotle? Is there something there that we can learn from? And some scholars would say, if you're looking at their description of how the weather works, for instance, or their description of how grammar works, or their description of logic and mathematics and geometry, what's wrong with that? It's just facts. There's nothing subversive to religion about learning Euclid's geometry. But when it came to metaphysical issues, there was a big crisis. And one of the arguments that was unresolved in Ghazali's time was, can you use Greek philosophy if the Greeks didn't believe that the world was created? They believed the world had always existed. Can you believe in Greek philosophy if one of the key principles of it was that God, which is this unitary, impersonal principle behind everything, doesn't know all of the little details of the things that happen in this world? Can you be a Muslim and believe in Greek philosophy if Greek philosophy says the world will go on forever, there won't be a resurrection? So Ghazali is particularly subtle in his approach here. He's not some kind of crude fundamentalist who says, well, they were all a bunch of pagans, so we can't learn from them. There were a few Muslims who took that view, but actually not many. Generally, his civilization adopted the approach that he describes as that of the skilled money changer who knows a good coin from a bad coin and is so experienced that he can put his hand into the bag of the money changer and pull out the coin that's real gold and ignore the false coin. And he says with the wisdom and the philosophy of other civilizations, if you know your stuff, you can do the same thing. You can go to Plato, go to Aristotle, pull out things that can be very useful for religion. Logic can be very useful in legal issues, for instance. The study of grammar, a lot of other things are practically beneficial. The study of medicine, for instance. But he says, in order to do that, you really have to know your stuff. You can't say, we'll take some things from Greek philosophy, unless you really know the whole system. And the greatness of his approach was that he really understood the legacy of Plato and Aristotle, as was crystallized for the Arabs in the works of Avicenna, Ibn Sina, about a century before Al-Ghazali in his part of the world, and was able to explain to the whole Muslim world what is it that we can benefit from these other civilizations, and what are the things that we really have to refuse because they're too subversive of Quranic truth.
And he also brought out a book called Tahafud al-Falasifa,
That's right, yeah.
Incoherence of the Philosophers. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
This is one of the great books of the world's intellectual history, really, because one of the tensions in Europe and in the Islamic world in the Middle Ages was, if you have a revelation, the Bible or the Quran, that describes the creation of the world, the meaning of life, God's power, God's qualities, what is the relationship of that to reason? What if reason suggests certain things that seem to be in tension with revelation? And that's a constant in Christian theology and in Islamic theology. Can something be reasonable but conflict with revelation? If so, what do we do? Do we just follow the scripture and assume that reason is somehow mistaken, but you can't see how it's mistaken. That's always going to be a problem. Ghazali wrote this book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, in order to show that the philosophers, where they clash with the Quran, clash with it because they're being unreasonable, not because they're being reasonable. So he takes this big issue of, does God know everything that's in the world? And Plato and Aristotle will say no, because he's absolutely simple and doesn't have his knowledge of the world differentiated into lots of different things that he knows. And he uses Avicenna's own philosophy to show that actually, on philosophical grounds, it's unreasonable to believe that God doesn't know particulars, the juz'iyat, the little bits of creation, of things in creation. So the brilliance of the book is that he's not saying philosophy is wrong because the Quran says something else. He's saying philosophy is wrong on those issues for rational reasons. So he plays a very important role in integrating a pretty thoroughgoing rationality into what then becomes the story of Islamic kalam or Islamic theology. And we're only just waking up to the fact that rationality in Islamic civilization really starts to spread its wings with the works of Al-Ghazali. He's not an anti-rationalist. He's not against philosophy. He just says the philosophers of his time got certain things wrong, but we're very much in favor of reason.
Yes. So the source of knowledge in Islam, 40 books. Why is this work so important?
Well, Ghazali wrote very many books that were fundamentally important. He wrote the great books of law in the Shafi'i tradition, for instance, both in terms of detailed law books with dozens of volumes with all of the little details, and in terms of works of theoretical jurisprudence, how the law is actually derived and what is its moral justification. He wrote, as we've indicated, the Tahafut, which is his book against some errors of the philosophers. He also wrote books against certain esoteric extreme sects in his day. He also wrote books about politics and ethics. He writes in most subjects.
How many books did he write?
Well, we don't know how many of the books that are said to be his he really wrote, but it's probably around 200 in total. Some of them quite short, but some of them, like the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, which you just mentioned, 40 books. Yeah. It's a huge encyclopedia. And his law books are even longer, some of them. So the Ihya, the Revival of the Religious Sciences, which was one of his later books, is the one that is best known amongst Muslims. Even though it doesn't have a strong abstract or rationalizing or programmatic dimension to it at all. What it is an attempt to encourage people to be transformed spiritually the way Imam Ghazzali felt that he'd been transformed spiritually. He thought that all of the problems in the Islamic world of his time, intellectual problems, heresies, political issues, could be resolved if people were spiritually alive and vibrant. And that was his own experience, because he'd been a very vainglorious, exoteric, proud professor and had suffered his famous crisis, and he only managed to pull himself together again, not through reading more books about philosophy, but through experiencing what he calls tasting, dhawq, the reality of the experience of God. He wanted to universalize that experience. He wanted everybody to be cured the way he'd been cured. So it's a kind of medical textbook for the sicknesses of the heart. But he goes through everything in great detail. How you pray and how you internalize your prayer, how you do the pilgrimage to Mecca and how you do it with your heart as well as with your body, how you deal with other people, how you deal with marriage, how you deal with journeys, how you deal with children, how you deal with character faults and virtues, how you deal with death, all of the big human issues he tackles.
And you mentioned his own spiritual transition or transformation. What actually happened? He was this erudite scholar, he was a theologian, exoteric, as you said. What happened to him then?
Part of the drama of his life is that he was, at the age of 30 or even younger, at the top of the academic hierarchy of the day. He'd been appointed by the Grand Vizier to be head of the Nizamiya Academy in Baghdad, which was like the Cambridge of the day, and he was the top professor, and he was still really young and had hundreds of the best students from the whole Islamic world who had come to sit at his feet, and it was staggering. And it seems to have gone to his head. And because of the early spiritual training that he'd received, remember Al-Farmadi and the Rose Garden and the religion of the heart, he starts to have doubts about his own intentions and about how coherent he is being. He wonders whether he is guiding other people to salvation, but he himself is doing it just for his own glory, and hence is going to hell. And that produces such a deep inner trauma that eventually he suffers a breakdown, and famously in the middle of a class he's struck dumb, he's unable to continue, and he walks out, and he doesn't return for 10 years. It's one of the great dramatic moments in Islamic civilization, because of that moment of realizing the falsity of his state.
But he must have come back with a new attitude, a new state of being.
Of course. He left as a professor who'd had a breakdown, and he returns as a saint who loved his people and wanted everybody to experience what he'd experienced. Total transformation had taken place. It's one of the great repentance stories in world history. And he was very much venerated in his last 5 or 6 years as a saint, as a holy person, not just as somebody who was still writing great books of law and theology.
Well, and how he went about trying to teach this transformation to the people around him, we'll find out right after the break. Stay with us right here on Matters of Faith.